University of Trumpland, a podcast by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to our podcast which is titled University of Trumpland. Fear, disgust, horror, rioting and visible racist, sexist and homophobic attacks. That's been the last week since Donald Trump became President of the United States. Now, I'm not remotely interested in why the media got it so wrong. The war of position and consensus politics is over. I would argue it's been over for 30 years. Digitisation has fragmented and shattered any sense of the audience, any sense of the truth. What I want to talk about today with Steve Redhead, the Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University, is about what did actually happen and what is going to happen next. So, Steve, was Trump's victory a win for the silent majority or simply a win for the white working class man who's no longer in work?
Well, it's a great question, and I think one that's exercising the whole globe at the moment. I think it's interesting that this is now manifestly an example, a really significant example of the rise of the right globally. The shift to the right is manifestly here, and we need to do something about it. I think Stuart Hall, at the time, the director of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, said in the late 1970s and early 1980s about the UK that there was a great moving right show. I think he was wrong then, he's right now. The great moving right show has been moving here for a long time, for decades, as you've suggested. My colleagues in the UK, Steve Hall, Simon Winlow and James Treadwell, have a book which is just about to come out called The Rise of the Right, which everybody should read.
Indeed.
If anybody wants to understand Trump and Brexit and One Nation, the Pauline Hanson far-right party in Australia. They want to understand any of that phenomenon. The Rise of the Right is a must-read book. The subtitle to that book is actually English Nationalism and the Transformation of Working Class Politics. But you can substitute something nationalism.
Yes.
And the transformation of working class politics. And I think you've got an American nationalism and the transformation of working class politics in the US right now. I think you've got a really significant, I would say, coup in the US. And it's at the moment, a peaceful transformation to a far right in the White House. I mean, there are connections between people who are associated with Trump and European fascism. Fascist groups in places like Holland. Russia has a fascism, for example, which Putin tolerates in a lot of ways, and it was those sorts of connections with Russia, actually, which were the significant ones in the build-up to the win by Trump. I do think, though, that you say you're not interested in the media politics.
No.
But I do think there's something significant there. And my argument is that someone like Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard, who died in 2007, but his posthumous work is really still worth looking at on this question. He was writing in the late 70s and early 80s about how basically political science and polling and so on were over, actually. That sort of death knell that people are calling now after Trump's win, which trumped the media, the liberal media in particular. But I think what happened then was explained by Baudrillard, that what he called the silent majorities, the masses, were actually no longer prepared to play the game. And it was at the very time that left governments, particularly in Europe in the late 70s and early 1980s, they were involved in what Baudrillard calls a double refusal. The refusal of those in the citizenry to be dominated, which is a bit like the American experience just now, and also the refusal to use power. That's what he was really getting at in a lot of ways. He produced a new book called The Divine Left, which was actually written in the late 1970s, early 1980s, all the way up to about 1984, now in an English translation. So I think it's very significant that this sort of stuff can now be read in English. I think that is important as far as what the media does. And in many ways, there was a media failure to basically explain what I've just said about the European fascism links to the people around Trump, for example. It was always an attempt to equalise the nastiness in this election. So Trump was as nasty as Clinton, Clinton was as nasty as Trump. It's absolute nonsense. Clinton is a centrist politician who's basically an establishment figure who was just attacked mercilessly by Trump and supporters, and actually including the FBI. So I think the media issue is an issue. The politics of the media is an issue. But I think what you're really seeing is a massive shift to the right globally.
Yeah. Two things to say about that. The first thing I would say to you is that the Gramscian war of position is over. That's what I mean about the fracturing. So when you're talking about even the whole metaphor, I know it was a complex theory, but the metaphor of the great moving right show, that's still Gramscian. Whereas what I'm actually arguing is, at this point,
there's a lot in that.
We've got a fracture. So we're no longer having a public discourse about ideas about work and leisure and family and nation. Those conversations are over. There has been a fracturing.
Yes.
And just for one example, and I hope to get this party correct, to give you a sense of the fracturing, most of you know that we used to live in a little country town in Australia called Bathurst. Its twin town was a place called Orange. And they had an election yesterday, and obviously it's a very conservative place. It's a country town, country town. And so you would expect them to vote for the National Party. Yeah. But they didn't vote for the National Party. They've ended up putting in a member from the shooting, fishing and farming party. Let's hope I've got those nouns in the right order. So that's what I'm sort of saying to you, is that this is no longer a discussion about key ideas or anything consensual. What can we all agree on? My argument is there isn't enough to agree on anymore. And just picking up on the Baudrillard point you've made there, I concur with everything you've said there, but I don't think that's about the media. I think we are in the simulacrum that he was right, and it's no longer, we've lost the disconnect to the real. There is no representation. Yeah. We now have a reality television person, reality television person who's now having a simulacrum presidency.
Very interesting.
Do you agree or disagree?
I do, and the reality TV background of Trump, of course, helps all of that, and it fits with, if Baudrillard was still alive, I'm sure he would be excoriating Trump for that.
Yeah, exactly. It's stunning. And therefore, I want to talk about two words that have been pumped around a lot in the last year, and these two words have worried me a lot, and I want us to really focus on them and try and talk about them with our wonderful podcasting crew. And those two words are establishment and elites. And interestingly, you've used one of those words in your last answer. Now, who exactly are these people?
Yes, I think, I mean, they are vague labels, but I think they do correspond to some kind of reality. But I think they are used particularly by the right to explain a particular sort of consensus in the neoliberal years. I think the interesting thing that's happening now is clearly globalization and neoliberalism are on the agenda. They've dominated for the last 40 years or so the globe. Yeah. And they are now on the agenda because in some ways you can see the rise of the current neo-populist right around the world as an attack on those two things. But the interesting thing is that it's an increase in nationalism, an increase in the neo-right populism after globalization.
Boom.
We've not had that. If you go back to the 1930s, when, of course, Hitler was elected, I remind people, Hitler was elected.
Yeah, I think people demonise Hitler. They need to recognise Hitler was a politician who went out and had rallies, very, very successful rallies, and went out and managed to get the majority vote. Hitler was elected into office.
In the 30s. We're back to the 30s in many ways, in my view, and I've been arguing that since the global financial crisis, which is very much still with us. But I do think the issue to do with so-called elites and the establishment and so on. They're vague labels which really should be, that they hide, in fact, class formations and political formations which really should be analysed. But I think the point about the idea of the elite is that in some ways left liberalism has been implicated in these changes underneath that idea of the elite. I mean, the Clintons, who are centre-right politicians, in my view, had and the Obamas, for example, they symbolise a particular sort of consensus politics in neoliberalism.
Nice.
But I think those things are now shifting. So the elites and the establishment are the labels that the neo-right, like Trump, actually use vitriolically. Yeah. And that's why the hatred was so great against a woman politician like Hillary Clinton, who I say is a centrist bureaucrat in many ways, a very experienced bureaucrat. So you're going to get more of that. And the throwing of the vitriol against all sorts of so-called outsiders and the other includes the idea, this vague idea of the establishment, and who knows who that is in these people's terms, and the elites. And the media is included in that, the so-called liberal media. But it's a way of poisoning political discourse in many ways from the right.
Yes, and I love the word poisoning. It's poisoning it so that actually nobody can drink. That's the point about this. There is nothing positive out of this.
No.
What I just got out of your answer is this neo-right, and I'm getting very comfortable using that now, is actually a post-neoliberal, and I think that's correct.
It is.
And it's also a post-neocon, a post-neoconservative neo-right.
Yep.
So that means it's not about outward expansion, replicating the American dream, American democracy, American militarism elsewhere. All of that's gone. And the neoliberal discourse has gone.
Yep.
Now that's powerful because with digitisation and the mobility of international capital, what happens to the mobility of money and ideas and all the rest of it post-neoliberalism? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's a reaction to globalisation in a particular formation and a reaction to neoliberalism in a particular formation. Those eras are over. Yeah. More or less. Not in the university, interesting enough, as the neoliberal university continues to rise. But actually, I think there is a comparison to the 1930s fascism. If you look back at that era, you had a mixture of left and right policies by fascist parties like Hitler's. And you get it here in what Trump is arguing, and very deliberately, by the way. So protectionism and globalisation, both. But a lot of it is what would conventionally be seen as anti-neoliberal, and that's a really interesting and significant shift.
I concur. Now, you haven't quite answered for me the elitism establishment variable, but I will come back to that in a couple of questions, including this one. I'm going to push you a bit further, and I particularly want to return to whiteness, the unmarked sign, to some of that great Roland Barthes phrase. Now, whiteness. People like us who are taught their whole life that they are the masters of the universe. We never have to think about the colour of our skin. We move through life with lightness and shape, with destiny in front of us. So the KKK obviously is the extreme edge of this, but whiteness, I argue, is the punctuation of power. So what do we learn about whiteness from the Trump victory?
Well, I think you can go back to, for example, the Brexit unforeseen circumstance, which in many ways is linked to what Trump is doing. He's actually meeting with Nigel Farage, of the former leader of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, at the moment, literally. So that's significant. There is a white supremacist politics, which is certainly there in UKIP, and it's fascist thugs from the streets, in the case of the EDL, the English Defence League. I think that the issue of whiteness has become a major factor on the agenda globally, politically. And this is the revenge of the white supremacists in many ways. And the leaderless working class of Michigan, of Pennsylvania, and so on, are implicated in all of this. It has had, since the global financial crisis, no leaders of the left, certainly. The elites abandoned those people. There's no question in my mind. The Democratic Party, the centre of the Democratic Party, it basically did leave those people to Trump.
Yes.
And there is a white supremacy in the sort of arguments that Trump makes on the stump, and I don't think that's accidental. This is deliberate, and the people around Trump have this kind of far-right politics, and we're going to see a great deal more of this globally. We're already seeing it in a place like Australia where we live. A Pauline Hanson One Nation party, a far-right party, which is actually holding the country to ransom by being able to change in the Senate legislation in their favour. They hold the balance of power. It's incredible. And a party like that is on, say, Sky News nightly, talking as if this is just banal politics. We've normalised this issue around whiteness.
We've normalised saying the unsayable too.
We
That's
have.
the other thing. You said to me a decade ago, we mustn't reach a culture where you can say the unsayable.
Yeah.
I don't believe in free speech. I know you get cross when I say that, but I don't believe in free speech, because what free speech is, the people who actually are in power get to gob off as much as they like, and the actual people living a life, having a family, doing business, we've got no say, no culture anyway. Having said that, you and I, we have complete freedom of speech, we have podcasts, we can do whatever we like, but a bunch of people do not have that. And what I would say to you is, therefore, is Corbyn important to this conversation? Because I was thinking last night, for example, I wonder if the Blairites, which of course dominate the Labor Party still, the Blairites, Brownites, still dominate the party, and that's why Corbyn never gets popular support from the parliamentarians. I wonder if they've got a shock from this. So if the Blairites and the Brownites keep going in that Clinton-esque way, the third way stuff, they wouldn't have got in anyway. So I wonder if they've learned that maybe Corbyn, who is remaining hooked in with working class communities no longer in work, do you think that might wake them up, that they've got to actually change from that Blairite third way?
I think it will wake up, and has already wakened people in Britain. I do. But I think the shift to the right is so great that this isn't something we can sit around doing nothing about, because the rise of the right is actually about the decline and fall of the left. Yeah. And I mean, by left, I don't mean centre left. No. There is an evacuation of the political space that the European Labour movement, for example, once held. And you're looking at elections in places like Italy and Austria, not very far off, and you're going to get a shock. You're going to get, they're both countries that have flirted with the far right.
And Le Pen.
And Le Pen, Marie Le Pen in France too, Wilders in Holland, I can go on. I think there's a political illiteracy, particularly in the United States, that we've got to reverse. And I think that's also true in Europe. Corbyn is part of a movement which leads political literacy. I think he's had a lot of interesting things to say already about Trump and the real significance of that victory.
Yeah, very powerful. There's an undercooked variable that we need to discuss in this podcast. And I suppose it's continuing the sociological mantra, if you will. But I want to talk overtly and clearly about women, about femininity and the feminine through this. Now, sexism and misogyny rarely surprises me. I'm a 46, 47-year-old woman. Anything that could have happened has happened. Any bloke that's want to go the grab, he's gone the grab. Anything that could have happened has happened. But even I'm surprised and horrified with the pussy grabbing, the obsession with valuing women only by appearance. The misogyny that I've seen has taken my breath away. And why I think a lot of women have been so upset about this is a lot of things you can say about Hillary Clinton that we may talk about, but she is a successful woman, very well educated, had a career of public service, however you may define that, has had a life of success, married, a child, all the conventional feminine trappings as well. And yet through that life of profound success, even that wasn't good enough to beat an ill-educated, what do we call him? Ill-educated clump of a man. So what is going on with the feminine here and the misogyny, the structural hatred of women? This isn't sexism, this is misogyny.
Yeah, this is a real wake-up call for those who don't think there's a role for really strong feminism internationally. I think it's been coming a very, very long time. This stripping back of liberalism and feminism has been coming a long time. And the sort of things that you described have been part of the fabric, of the West in the last 40, 50 years, since first wave feminism. And I think what has really struck us is the rise of a structural misogyny. You're
Yes.
absolutely right.
Yep.
This isn't casual.
No.
This isn't accidental. And what Trump represents is a widespread rise of misogyny internationally, and that that we actually we must not ignore this. Masculinity has to be policed by feminism, and I think that's got to be on an international scale. This is a real wake-up call. It's a real warning.
Yeah, and what I'd say is, just so listeners can hear what Steve said, he said this quite early in my marriage, that masculinity needs to be policed by feminism. Now, of course, I took a breath there thinking, oh, look, that's not what we're meant to do. That old great headline was like, damn whores and God's police. Our job is not to be policing masculinity. But, of course, Steve is a little bit older than me, and he lived through, as a very young man, actually, that sort of 60s, the excesses of that elite masculinity that really preyed on women, I would argue, as part of the 60s permissiveness before feminism arrived. And then you actually, as a young man, were growing through that early feminism in the 70s. So why are you so staunch on that? And you use words like patrolling, like masculinity's got to be caged up, because what? It's going to go bonkers and stuff.
Yeah, I do think that's true. It's Lacanian. There is the words and strategy of Trump, for example, were absolutely deliberate. As I say, this isn't accidental. It's not just a matter of someone who was, clearly supporting the whole idea of attacks on women. I don't care what he says afterwards. That's what he was doing. Because that is part of a masculinity which is freely available. And I think the real problem now is that what you're going to get is such a backlash against what you were talking about before, which is the 1960s progressive legislation. Yes. So, for example, I fully expect appointments to the Supreme Court which will be of a very right-wing nature. Now, that matters. There will be attacks on Roe versus Wade, which is the legislation in the 1960s which liberalised abortion. And I think also gay marriage in the US. I mean, you name it. This is going to be a rolling back of what people thought was progressive social legislation, which was nailed on. Don't believe it. And that is where one of the battlegrounds will be. Trump has already signalled that, but that's also happened in all of the rise of the far right, in all the countries we're talking about. And it's coming.
Yeah, it's a hatred of the feminine.
It is a hatred.
It's a hatred of the feminine, and that we're going to have to fight. I think
yes.
That's not going to be we lay back and take it.
No.
I think that one's going to have to be fought, because this ain't going to end well. We're going to see this in the workplace.
Yeah.
We're going to see this in family legislation.
Yes.
I mean, there's supposedly been an explosion of women in the United States getting an IUD fitted because they're so terrified that their contraception will fail that they're getting a bit of stuff, shoved up their clacker just in case, because they're not going to be able to have reproductive rights.
Yeah. This is a rollback, and
Whoa.
I do think because, as I say, it's almost a coup. It's actually, the far right in the White House. This is going to happen unless it is fought. And I do think that's also the case in these other countries. You can see it with the attacks on Muslims in Australia. This is legislative and political attacks, and indeed street attacks on Muslims, for example, in Australia, but particularly in the States, where the immigration laws are going to be moved way to the right.
Yeah, wow. Final question. which worries me even more than gender, and that is education. Reading. Knowing things. For me, this victory of Trump is a victory of the ignorant. It's a victory of the foolish. It's a victory of the undereducated. And I'm not pulling back from that. I'm not going to justify, oh, look, we need to listen more. I'm sorry. Every time racism emerges, we need to call that out. That's not about understanding or going, oh, look, I'm sure, there's a reason for the racism. Call that racism out. It is ignorant, it is wrong, it is foolish, and it is violence through words. So why do you think education and people who have sacrificed their life to get education, to read, to learn, to think, create, why has education been confused with elitism? And what can those of us in universities learn from Trump and the Trump success, and indeed do something about it?
Well, we certainly do live in anti-intellectual times, and Trump is a great example of it. I mean, clearly doesn't read. And the celebration of the anti-intellectual is absolutely stunning. But I think there's something structural. I think in neoliberalism, as neoliberalism, globalisation, particularly in the 90s and the 2000s, really was on the rise. There was an expansion, for example, of higher education in the various universities that we've worked at in the last 20 years. There was the claim, like in the Blair years, that you should try and get 50% of 18 to 25-year-olds into higher education because the knowledge economy demanded that. The new knowledge economy was the justification for that. But as that turned, as neoliberalism started to fail economically, manifestly, you actually had the idea that people who went to get a degree or a higher degree even were wasting their time and wasting their money. There was a real movement for that. So both within the universities and outside the universities, that was the case. So I think that wasn't an accident. It was, people in various countries around the world had bought into the idea that higher education was a good thing. And governments had bought into that idea. Yes. That's being rolled back, and Trump is manifestly a symbol of that.
Yeah, and just to give an example of that, we just found out this morning that in the sort of the planning cabinet, the planning organisation before he becomes president, in this, I think it's almost like a proto-cabinet, so the change management committee, if you will, yes. He's appointed 3 of his own children into that planning committee. Now, when we were talking about elite and elitism and the establishment, that's where things have got all a little bit confused, because I think that was a post-industrial revolution model of elitism. So in other words, it's the people who have sacrificed their life to read and go to school and work hard and go to university, not play about, not get drunk, not fall over, actually sacrifice their present for the future to learn something. Yeah. For some reason, that group of people have been called the elite, rather than what is now, with the Trump situation, a feudal power coup.
It is.
So this is War of the Roses time. This is families. We're back to families. Powerful billionaire families ruling for other powerful billionaire families. Yeah. So it's a feudal power elitism that's critiquing the people who actually did have some social mobility through education. Is that fair enough?
I think it is, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. The criticism, as you say, is of someone like Hillary Clinton, who spent her whole life, her whole post-education life, preparing actually for this moment and to be the best qualified and to be the best she could. That's a classic example, and I agree. That then draws the poisonous label, the elite.
Powerful. Steve, thank you for this conversation. As podcast listeners have heard, we're pretty agitated about this. We've waited 3 days after the election to wait to the weekend to sort of settle ourselves a little bit. I am frightened as a person who's probably got 15, 20 years left of their career as a woman working in universities and in public service and public care and community engagement. I am frightened for the planet. I'm frightened in terms of climate change. I'm frightened in terms of when we're educating people in universities. We're trying to help men and women become the best person they can be. So one day they could be in the White House or they could be in the Lodge in Australia. And the notion that all their struggle and learning and care and respect and decency for others could end in a moment like this, I think is absolutely devastating.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call.